I think one of the opinions written by Justice Anthony Scalia, one could read it as a real strong and robust, powerful case for state-level immigration law. I think one could read it as saying states have this power and states are allowed to do what they want with regards to the regulation of the movement of non-citizens, regardless what the federal government is doing.
Professor Gulasekaram, in the last segment, we talked about how in the 1870s and thereafter, there were state laws restricting access to education or employment for unauthorized persons in the United States, illegal immigrants, social services, and sort of we went all the way up to SB 1070 in Arizona. I don't want to talk about any one of those specifically. What I'm wondering is this: what if the federal government sort of abdicates its responsibility to control our borders? And I'm not saying this in the political context. Literally, it just drops the ball. And, it's not supervising or implementing even immigration laws that we have. Now, let's say Arizona or whatever state is stuck with taking care of immigrants, or pick any states, right? So I don't know, what is the recourse for these states then? I told you it's not a political question, but it turned out to be a political question, right?
Yeah, Adele, I may have heard you incorrectly, but I may have heard you as saying 1870s when you meant 1970s, right? Maybe
1970s. Yes, thank you for correcting me. Yes, 1970s.
Yeah. So I think that, first of all, I think it's important to note that this claim that the federal government has abdicated its responsibility is, in fact, the claim that the state of Arizona and its governor made in 2010 when it enacted its laws. And SB 1070 is a very famous picture of then Governor Jan Brewer confronting then President Obama on the tarmac at an airport in Arizona, and she, you see her wagging her finger at Obama, and it's famously captured in media reports as Governor Jan Brewer really telling Obama that he needs to do his job, the federal government needs to do his job, and if he doesn't do his job, then Arizona is going to do the job that the federal government can't. In fact, if you look, there's a similar picture to Governor Greg Abbott meeting President Biden more recently and handing him a letter. And that letter purports to do the exact same thing that Governor Jan Brewer was doing, a decade prior. That is telling President Biden that he needs to get moving on immigration, that the federal government has abdicated its responsibility. And this is why the state has stepped in. Now, so that type of claim as a matter of political theater or a way of justifying state action, that is an age-old claim that has been made for decades, and certainly in the last couple decades, it's one that states like Arizona and Texas have used.
And it could be applied to other areas of law, for example, environment, many other things, right?
That's right. It can be applied anywhere. It has perhaps some special symbolic and other type of resonance for us because it's done by, let's say, in these two cases, we're talking about governors of border states in Arizona and Texas. Now, it's worth noting that you don't see the governor of California or the governor of New Mexico doing the same thing, right?
Because they're Democrats,
Yeah, which is to say that this idea that the federal government has abdicated its responsibility is not a claim that I think there's no way of, I think, objectively measuring and saying yes or no to that question, right? The federal government, of course, has a significant structure at the border, right? That is the entirety of the border infrastructure is based on federal ports of entry regulation, federal border agents, a significant enforcement force within the federal government. I believe federal immigration authorities are second only to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in number of federal employed federal.
Oh, wow. ICE is that big after FBI? wow.
I think,
Okay.
yeah, I have to go back and look. It might be all of federal immigration authorities, not just ICE, right?
I
ICE,
see.
Border Patrol, et cetera, right? So it's a significant federal enforcement authority. So in one sense, your question is based on a premise about which there is significant disagreement. That is, what does it
Yeah.
mean to actually abdicate responsibility over federal immigration? Because if we take the robust federal laws that regulate admissions and deportation, federal laws that regulate asylum, federal laws that create the entire enforcement infrastructure at the border, one could reasonably say, I think, that the federal government has not abdicated its responsibility. But what we're arguing about is that it should be more. Right? That
Yeah.
this is not about abdication. It's that there should be more regulation, more enforcement, more border walls, etc. Maybe, right? Except Congress has not done so. Congress has not done much of anything with regards to immigration law, but it certainly hasn't increased the border enforcement infrastructure with regards to significantly more funding, or at least the funding that would be required to do the types of things that would make Arizona and Texas political jurisdictions happy and perhaps withdraw their claims. And maybe partly because it's a very convenient political claim to make, right? It's a very popular claim to make in those states. That
Goes into the heart of nationalism.
That's right. The federal government has abdicated its responsibility. We have to step up. We have to be robust in enforcing these laws. And so I know it's a little bit of a dodge from the question you asked, but I think that is one way of thinking about this, that whether the federal government has abdicated or not is a matter of perspective and political convenience.
So let's go back to my question and answer it legally. Let's just put politics aside for a second. Mm-hmm. If it was the case, let's use a hypothetical, as we both know from law school days. Hypo. Let's do a hypo here. Let's say that the federal government did abdicate its responsibility regarding immigration, which also could apply to other areas of law. Mm-hmm. The state couldn't come and say, because you didn't do XYZ per this law, that's a federal law, we're going to have our own legislation now and enforce that. That's not the recourse. The recourse is to sue the government, the federal government. Am I correct on that? You're shaking your head.
It's a great question. I'm not sure we have a great answer to it.
Seriously, we don't?
I think that in the pre-Civil War, pre-1870s time, if you look at the state of regulation at that time, one might say, drawing from that, states always had a power to regulate who comes into the state and who gets through their borders, their ports of entry. And perhaps that would justify, in a hypothetical world where there was no federal immigration regulation at all, a return to that time. Maybe, right? Yeah. On the other hand, one might say that what we've learned at that time, what our constitutional structure has divulged, is that the regulation of movement into the country, whether the federal government has regulated it or not, is still inherently a federal responsibility. So at that moment, it's not for states to regulate, but rather to use their power in Congress to lobby the federal government to do so, to tell their representatives to go to Congress to enact this sort of federal law. But still, it would not be proper for states to enact their own immigration regulation. I think
just like they would lobby for other laws, right?
That's right. That's okay. Just like any other laws. And this one in particular would be of such importance that if enough states wanted it to happen, it would clearly happen, right? Now, as everything I've just said, I'm not there. Please don't take it to mean that this is the only perspective on this issue, right? This is one person's perspective on this issue. It is highly contested territory. If you read the
contested also in academia.
That's right. If you read the Supreme Court opinions in Arizona versus United States, the 2012 case, which struck down much of Arizona's attempts to regulate immigration on its own, I think one of the opinions written by Justice Anthony Scalia, one could read it as a real strong and robust, powerful case for state level immigration law. I think one could read it as saying states have this power, and states are allowed to do what they want with regards to the regulation of the movement of non-citizens, regardless what the federal government is doing. Now, I think that's a minority position, but my point to you is that there are people within legal circles that might make that argument. I think it's an impossible argument to make in our current moment, where there is not just a little federal regulation, but robust and comprehensive federal immigration regulation and regulation of the border. In your hypothetical world where all of that goes away, I think we're once again plunged into uncertainty about what the legal parameters are for state regulation versus federal regulation.
My issue, putting the ethics and politics of immigration aside, is if states have their own direct or indirect laws and ordinances regarding immigration, just like the example I shared with you about patent law, then it would be mayhem. I mean, chaos. Then immigrants would go state shopping, right? Don't go to Oregon, don't go to California, go to New Hampshire, don't go to New York, that sort of thing. That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, that does happen informally now.
Yeah.
And I guess the question or the thought that I have for you in response is whether you think, and that this is a fundamental problem that courts wrestle over in this area, is this claim about disuniformity and the chaos and mayhem that would occur, is that just a good policy reason for there to be significant uniform federal legislation and only the federal regulation in this area? Or does it also translate into a constitutional mandate that there only be federal regulation and one uniform policy in this area? That, I think, is most simply stated the conflict in this area of immigration federalism.
Yeah, those are questions that require sort of, I don't know, a deeper discussion. Perhaps another episode. If you wanted our audience to remember just one point about immigration and federalism after everything we've talked about, what would it be?
Yeah, I think it's a broader point about immigration in general, and that is that the migration of humans has been a fact of human life and human history since the dawn of humanity. People have moved from where they've been. That all said, still, most of the world, over 97% of the world, still lives in the country and in the place in which they were born. So it's still a very small percentage that leaves and goes to other places. That, coupled with the fact that people come to the United States even knowing that there is, for example, at our southern border, knowing that there is significant danger, significant risk of death or bodily harm, they will still come. All of this is to say, and the reason I say this is to say that even if we're talking about national immigration policy, the idea that we can enforce our way out of migration, that we can unilaterally dictate migration, I think is a fantasy. Now,
really? Oh, wow.
I think if I'm saying that about our national immigration policy, I think it goes doubly true for individual states and localities. That if we think that unilateral state policies can actually impact and influence migration in ways that are broad and meaningful, I think that is a fantasy. I think that what we should instead see, at least contemporary state and local immigration policies, especially enforcement-minded policies, really as about being able to mobilize particular political constituencies to make claims on what immigration policy should be, and to project a vision of immigration policy rather than as actual important pieces of public policy legislation. That would be the one point that I would make.
Thank you for sharing that. And by the way, yesterday, the Wall Street Journal had a report about how most developed nations, the UK, even South Korea and Japan, certainly Canada, are inviting a lot of immigrants, huge numbers, to do the work that their native-born citizens won't do. And the exception, the report stated, was the United States. So goes to your statement about the inability to unilaterally stop that. Professor Gulasekaram, thank you so much for educating me and our listeners. And to our listeners, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. Thank you so much.